pass them towards the middle. If you need a stapler, I have a stapler. If you have projects, also pass those towards. Okay, very briefly, read titles if there are titles. That doesn't have a title per se. Relevance of Middle English literature in the modern world. Meditation on the Wanderer and the Seafarer. Lana, Lana, all is Lana. Poetic series, Gentle Lesson, The Wife of Bath's Tale. Proto-feminism, but I can't read today. Proto-feminism in The Wife of Bath Prologue and Tale. A response to Sir Gawain of the Green Knight. The Wanderer Reflection. Paganism versus Christianity in Beowulf. Editorial columns on the moral value of age-old English poetry. What makes someone a good king? This will get stuck on other papers, that's why I took it off. Beowulf, the cause of their suffering. Love, 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 something dreams come, lover boy. Sorry, my eyes are messed up. Modern significance of selected classic British literature and drawings and commentary. Okay, picking up, sent you, I believe, an email with a link to finish the last couple of sonnets that we didn't cover. And I'll tell you at the beginning of class rather than end of class, I'm going to put up a quiz today that'll be over the background information in Shakespeare sonnets. It'll be over all the sonnets that are on the syllabus. In the first, I looked at it either this morning or yesterday, the first 6 or 7, maybe 8 questions, there are 15 plus extra credit, are the opening 2 lines of a sonnet. Okay? Identify the sonnet by sonnet number. I'm pretty sure they're all ones discussed. That'll be, today's Tuesday. I'll make that due Thursday or Friday. I don't know that if we'll have a quiz over the remaining stuff because time's moving on quickly and we're going to finish Tuesday of next week. Anyways, picking up today with Ben Jonson. On 902, 903. A couple comments about Jonson. I'm also going to put up on D2L today. It's not going to be on exam or anything like that, just for your viewing pleasure if you want to see it. The title page from Jonson's 1616 collected edition of his works, okay? And the reason I'm putting this up is because Ben Jonson is the first writer of English that we know of who considered what he did as a writer to be work. I mean, employment, okay? And he's the first one to publish, while he's still alive, a collection of his writings and call that work. And the title page has this massive edifice, like a temple or a big bank building almost. And it has inscribed on it, the works of Benjamin Jonson. Little background. Ben Jonson's father was a bricklayer. I don't know if you've ever done anything with bricks. I worked for about 3 months as a mason's apprentice, worked, with bricks and cement and mortar and all that kind of stuff. And I usually kind of imagine if his father was still alive when he was writing, and I don't know if he was, but if he was, I can imagine, dinner around the table and then going, son, that ain't work. Sitting there with a quill in ink and paper, not work. Doing what I do, that's work. But his father did well enough, let's say, that Jonson went to the most elite school in London and got a very good education. And then went to university, but my mind is failing me on where. Pretty sure he went to university. Became an acknowledged master of classics, Greek and Latin. Okay? And acknowledged himself to be a master of Greek and Latin. Jonson was not known for his lack of ego. Let me kind of put it that way. All right? Wrote a lot of plays, wrote a lot of poetry, wrote literary criticism. Some of his plays are still considered very famous and still get produced. Every Man and His Humor gets produced almost every summer in London. Volpone or The Fox, pretty much the same, but most of his other plays aren't produced. And if they're read by people like you and people like me. English majors, English professors, graduate students wanting to find something, write a dissertation on that somebody hasn't done yet, etc. He's not read and appreciated like Shakespeare is read and appreciated. To Jonson's eternal, not shame, chagrin, probably would be the best word to use. He was kind of, as you'll see when we get to the epitaph on Shakespeare, he's a little bit jealous of Shakespeare's reputation. Okay. What else? Contemporaries of Shakespeare, new John Donne. We've got a poem to John Donne by him. We have surviving a record or transcript of a conversation that Jonson had, or conversations that Jonson had with a Scottish writer named William Drummond. And it's kind of interesting because in these conversations, it's like Jonson lets his hair down and has a few drinks and gets very uninhibited. And he talks, for example, about John Donne, the next author we will read. And he says two key things about Donne. He said, Donne, for not keeping of accent, deserved hanging. Accent, iambic pentameter. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay? For not keeping that, he deserved hanging. Most critics today would say, not so much. He's accurate, however, that Donne doesn't keep accent. Donne does not write in iambic pentameter necessarily. Sometimes he does, but Donne likes to blow up paradigms and conventions. He's a free thinker in that sense. All right. He also said that because of his naughty syntax, K-N-O-T-T-Y, other people have written about Donne's naughty, N-A-U-G-H-T-Y writing. But for not keeping, for his naughty syntax, Donne wouldn't be read outside the 17th century. And he's largely right about that in terms of his poetry. By 1700, very few people were reading Donne's poetry. It's hard. When I was working on the Donne Variorum, there are not many editions of Donne's poetry from 1700 to 1912 or so. There are some, it's just very, very few. Not like Shakespeare, not like Chaucer. Tons of editions of Shakespeare and such. Donne was known, I think I mentioned this before, primarily as a sermonist, as a homily writer from 1700 to little after 1900. Donne's reputation gets revived in the early 20th century largely because of T.S. Eliot. In fact, almost entirely because of T.S. Eliot. Because Eliot writes an essay, in around 1922 or so, I think it is, titled The Metaphysical Poets. And Donne is the founder of what's called metaphysical poetry. From that point on, Donne's one of the most popularly written about writers of the Renaissance in English academic publications and such. The number used to be something like 30 articles a year were written about Donne. Definitely not that many about Jonson. Okay, I mean, maybe a half dozen. Anyways, 2 poems by Jonson on his children. And then we'll do the epitaph. So, on my first daughter, on my first son. Notice, on my first daughter, he obviously had more. On my first son, he obviously had more. But, rather unfortunately for Jonson and his wife, both their eldest children died. Here lies to each her parents' ruth, Mary, the daughter of their youth. Yet all heaven's gifts being heaven's due, it makes the father less to rue. At 6 months in she parted hence with safety of her innocence, whose soul heaven's queen, whose name she bears, in comfort of her mother's terrors, rhymed in Jonson's day, hath placed amongst her virgin train, where, while that severed doth remain, this grave partakes the fleshly birth, which cover lightly gentle earth. Here lies to each her parents' ruth. What does ruth mean? You don't have a gloss, do you? No. There should be.
Bitterness.
Louder?
Bitterness.
Bitterness? Possibly. What else? Where do we use that word today as part of a larger word? Ruthless. That's pretty much the only way ruth is used today. So what does ruthless mean?
No mercy.
No mercy. What else? It's true. What's another word that is often used to indicate mercy? They're totally different. Pity. So no pity. So mercilessly, pitiless, sorrowless, not mourning for something. Okay? If someone's a ruthless killer, that means they kill without mercy, they kill without pity, they kill without sorrow, they kill without any kind of sense of moral guilt, etc. Okay? So here lies to each her parents. Well, none of those words help. Her parents' ruth. Her parents' mercy, her parents' pity, her parents' sorrow. That one works. Mary, the daughter of their youth. So we're given the child's name, and we're told, relatively speaking, when in her parents' marriage she was born, when they were young. Okay? Yet all heaven's gifts being heaven's due, it makes the father less to rue. One of those papers that I read, the title, gets at the exact same idea Jonson's talking about. Lana, Lana, all is Lana. Look what he said. All heaven's gifts being heaven's due. What does that mean? They're owed back. Okay? It makes the father less to rue. The verb form of ruth. The noun form. Okay? So if you rue something, it means you feel sorry for it. You feel mercy and pity and sorrow for it. It makes the father less sorrowful, less full of pity, less full of etc. All heaven's gifts being heaven's due. They're owed back. At 6 months in, she parted hence with safety of her innocence. Now we're told how long she lived. 6 months. Why did she part with safety of her innocence?
She got baptized.
Probably.
She's a virgin.
Definitely, we hope. Definitely, unless there's some sicko around, which, there are everywhere. What else?
Baby can't really sing.
Yeah. I was talking about that with my first class. How does a 6-month-old sin? What do you have to do to sin? What must be involved? Some kind of choice. You got to choose to do it. I mean, so to speak, accidentally, sleep with someone else's spouse. You don't accidentally stab somebody in the back.
Haven't we talked about just a few weeks ago that all were born sinful until baptized?
Yes, according to the medieval Catholic Church, Jonson was Catholic, interestingly. That's still my first class. I don't know when this was written. We know when it's published. It's published in 1660. I don't know when Jonson's daughter died. If Jonson's daughter died in, let's say, the early 1590s, when Queen Elizabeth was king, he probably wouldn't have written this poem the way he does. Because there's a reference to Mary, the Queen of Heaven. That is a Catholic doctrine, or Catholic idea, not doctrine. Okay? Protestants generally don't like, especially in this time period, or take it back, in Elizabeth's day, Protestants didn't generally call Mary Queen of Heaven. All right? Because in the later years of Elizabeth's reign, she was rabidly anti-Catholic. I mean, having Catholics executed just for being Catholic. All right? So, all parted hence with safety of her innocence. Probably one baptized. Generally, I think it must be assumed, I've not looked into baptismal history in the Renaissance, but we know Shakespeare was baptized April 26th. All right? And partly because of that, scholars assume Shakespeare was born April 23rd. So that, to me, indicates 3 days after birth was probably the normal baptism for Catholics. Shakespeare's family was Catholic. And in the early 1560s, Catholicism hadn't been banned, hadn't been outlawed. Elizabeth was kind of practicing at that point, can't we all just get along? Don't ask, don't tell. I won't ask you about your religious beliefs. Don't tell me about your religious beliefs. Just keep them quiet and do what you want quietly. Okay? Parliament was a different matter, I should add. Parliament was passing stuff kind of reining in Catholicism. Okay? So at 6 months in, she parted hence with safety of her innocence. Baptism, and how can a 6-month-old commit a sin? I'll tell you because I told my first class. I was reading an article yesterday. I think it's by a Catholic priest. But the guy's talking about how Pope Benedict, when he was still Pope, did away with limbo as a place for the dead in the Catholic system. Limbo had never actually been, the idea of limbo, the place of limbo, had never actually been a part of Catholic dogma. That is, something you have to agree to be Catholic. Like, for example, the virgin birth. Or Mary as a virgin, kind of a thing. Limbo, it was taught from the late Middle Ages on, not the earlier Middle Ages, not the time of Dante, okay, but after that, 1300s, 1400s. Limbo was taken to be the place that unbaptized children went to, babies went to, and that people who had never had the opportunity to hear of the gospel. Like, somebody in Papua New Guinea, for example, okay? They went there, and it was just kind of a boring place. It wasn't damnation, it wasn't hellfire and punishment, it was just, like August 2nd, Murfreesboro, for all eternity. And that's it, all right? Pope Benedict, apparently relegated the notion of limbo to just a theory of a place after death. Prior to that, it had been pretty much a teaching, but not one that you had to, I believe, kind of a thing. So, safety of her innocence, she went to heaven. Whose soul, heaven's queen, whose name she bears. So now, again, we get her name re-emphasized. We've already been told it's Mary. Heaven's Queen. Not a Protestant idea. That's Catholic. That's entirely Catholic. Mary was also called Salve Regina, Queen of Salvation, or Queen of Salve, like healing, comfort. All right? There's a hymn called Salve Regina that was composed by St. Augustine. And it's all about how Mary can comfort those who are sorrowing here in the world. All right? Whose soul, heaven's queen, in comfort of her mother's tears, has placed amongst her virgin train. What does that mean, her virgin train? It sits in a not that kind of train. Keep going. How many of you have seen The Sound of Music? Great musical from the 1960s, Rodgers and Hammerstein. When Maria gets married, you remember the scene in the cathedral? You know, Captain Von Trapp's up there and the place is packed. And Julie Andrews comes in wearing this dress to end all dresses. Wedding dress of wedding dresses. I mean, what bride wouldn't want to get married in that? Because the train on it, if I remember, it's like 26 feet long. It's just huge. That's longer than this room. This room, I believe, is 20 by 20. Or 24 by 20, something like that. It's huge. Virgin train mean all the virgins who kind of line up and follow Mary. Dante has a beautiful depiction of this in the Paradiso. Okay? So, she's one of many following Mary. Mary's the model or ideal here. All right? Hath placed amongst her virgin train. Notice, who places little Mary there? Big Mary places her there. Kind of says, you're one of my followers. Or emulators. It's not like she really had a choice, right? I mean, she died when she was 6 months old. Where, while that severed doth remain, and your gloss tells you that severed, it's talking about the soul. Little Mary's soul will remain there in this heavenly train following Mary. This grave partakes the fleshly birth, because that's the spiritual birth. Her soul is left here, gone to there, and it will stay there forever. Here, meanwhile, her body does what? It gets placed in the ground. And in this last line, unless you're made of stone, it should kind of impact you, which cover lightly gentle earth. Why? What is Jonson saying? And let me add a little caveat. I don't remember if it was this class or my intro to lit. I think it was my intro to lit courses. Usually when you read poetry, you shouldn't assume that the speaker of the poem is the author. Like Shakespeare's sonnets. You assume the speaker of those sonnets is somebody the author creates as speaker. Kind of like what Chaucer does with the Canterbury Tales, with the character in the tales, Geoffrey Chaucer, right? With these two poems, however, by titling them On My First, Jonson wants us to read this as Jonson's voice. This is Jonson speaking. This is a parent grieving over a dead child. Cover lightly, gentle earth. What's he asking the earth not to do? Notice, not to do. What happens to graves over time? Decay. Louder? Decay. They decay.
So it just gets more.
When you bury someone, you put them, let's assume she's put in a box, coffin. They dig the hole, you put the box in. The box now takes what? Space in that hole. So when you put the dirt back in, it doesn't all fit. So what a good gravedigger will do, today that's pretty much all done with backhoes, is you mound over the leftover dirt on top. Why? Because as time passes, that dirt settles. And if it's a wooden box and nothing else, or if it's just a body in a shroud, as that body decays, as the wood decays and breaks, creates a hole, and the ground gradually falls. It's why sinkholes form, by the way. All right? And it caves in. A poem we're not reading because it's not British lit. Read Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Towards the end of it, beautiful poem, towards the end of it, you have this depiction of the speaker's grave, and at first it's mounded over, but as centuries go by, which actually don't because the speaker's in eternity, a hole forms. What's he saying? Don't squeeze my daughter. Don't put a lot of weight on her. Be gentle to her, earth. That's touching, or it should be touching. Okay? On my first son, sorry, my eyes are playing tricks on me today because my allergies are going crazy. On my first son, so he loses his daughter at 6 months. Farewell, thou child of my right hand, and joy. You've got a gloss for a child of my right hand. It means Benjamin. It's a Hebrew name. Get the characters right. Jacob, who had 12 sons, had 10 sons with Leah, the daughter of Laban he didn't want to marry, and he had 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, with Rachel, or I might be reversing those, I don't think I am, with Rachel, the one he did love, okay? He agreed to work for 7 years to marry one. The father puts the older sister in the bridal bed the night to get married. He wakes up, sees it's her, and he has to work another 7 years for the daughter he wanted to marry. Go back to Genesis. So, farewell, thou child of my right hand, and joy, my sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. Why right hand? Why does Jacob choose Benjamin as the name? What is it about the right hand? Well, the left hand in Latin we know is sinister, evil, bad, rotten. And whenever in the Old Testament God is anthropomorphized as acting with a hand, it's this one. It's always this one. The right hand of power, the right hand of glory, the right hand of majesty, the right hand of he who sits on high, etc. You know, the ascension, Jesus goes and sits at the right hand of God, meaning full power and majesty of God and such. But then you get line 2. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. What? How can you have too much love or hope in a child? Notice, my sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. Is he implying something?
Son didn't necessarily turn into the man he wanted him to.
Okay, because he died at 7. We're going to find out later. What else? You're close. Why'd the boy die? I think Jonson is implying my sin. The boy died because of Jonson's sin. What was Jonson's sin? The rest of the line. Too much hope of thee. How can a parent have too much hope of or in a child?
Prioritizing or glorifying the child over God.
Okay, possibly. Seeing the child as everything. What else? What do parents, maybe some of yours, I don't know. I've had students who have been more than willing to offer up, juicy details. Don't. What do some parents sometimes do inadvertently to their children. Louder? Favorites, possibly. I love little Benjamin. Sarah, go away. You don't count. Girl,
Is favor the boys over the doesn't want to say that?
Okay, possibly. That's not really what I'm getting at.
Oil then?
Keep going. Why? Bingo. Vicarious living. So, I could be totally wrong. Okay, I'll admit that right now. Maybe none of you will ever have this happen. There is a trope going around in our society that deals with women primarily. It deals with women only. And it's a young woman's about to get married. Anybody know how the rest of the trope goes? Mom is involved in the wedding. What happens? Louder? Momzilla. Yes.
The mom lives vicariously through the daughter.
Meaning, I'm going to have the wedding I never had. Or I'm going to have the perfect wedding. Susie, shut up. Stay out of this. Believe it, it is a trope. Every trope is based on what? Yeah, there is a germ of reality, a kernel of truth to that. Just like every myth that we know of, almost all myths probably are based on something that happened. It gets blown up, totally taken out of context, possibly. Somebody eats some good mushrooms and they look, and it just, this guy becomes Hercules or whatever, okay? Too much hope of thee. Parents often place an awful lot of pressure on their children. Why? What do parents, I'll speak for myself, what do I want for my children, who are all adults? Bingo. I want them to have a better life than I had. Just like I would think, not sure about this, my parents probably wanted me to have better lives than they had. They grew up in the Depression. And then, everything else. Too much hope. Jonson, the son of a bricklayer. There's a big push, universities today. Make sure, first gen students feel welcome. What does that mean? The first person in their family, the first generation in their family to attend a university. To break a cycle of, this part is implied. This is never said. To break a cycle of what? If you're going to the university and you're going to be a college graduate, that means what about you compared to someone who doesn't go to university and get a college degree?
Like break a cycle of poverty?
Yeah, that's the good way of putting it. I want a different word than poverty. Cycle of ignorance. The cycle of being uneducated. Because the idea in 21st century American society is you're not educated unless you get a college degree. Okay, that is utter, I'll say it, bullshit. You can be very well educated without having a college degree. Why? There's this wonderful little thing called YouTube where, you can get lectures from, I'm nobody. You can get lectures from Nobel Prize winning everything. Doctors, poets, physicists, engineers, chemists, all for free, okay? You don't have to attend a university to be educated. Jonson's father was uneducated. Jonson was. I think Jonson wants his son to have even more. 7 years thou wert lent to me. His son died when he was 7. And I thee pay exacted by thy fate on the just day. There's that language again. Jonson didn't know anything about Old English poetry. Anglo-Saxon was not taught as a language in the universities at this point. It doesn't get revived until much, much later. In the United States, Thomas Jefferson is the first one to really start reviving. What didn't he do, right? Anglo-Saxon. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. The language. You were alone, and I thee pay. That is, I pay you back. When? Exacted by thy fate. The fate, the one of the three Greek fates, who determines when we die. Her name was Atropos. She had scissors. She cut the thread of your lives. He's saying, the fate happened when? On the just day. It's like when little Ben was born, Mr. and Mrs. Jonson had given to them spiritually a promissory note. Here's your son Benjamin. You will repay him back on X day, X year. Or like when Shakespeare's parents were born, April 23rd, 1564. The loan will be due April 23rd, 1616. And that's when he dies. Okay? You got a gloss down there also. Oh, could I lose all father now? It's almost impossible for me to read that part of that line as an exclamation, because it sounds like a question. Oh, could I? Not, oh, I could lose all father now. What's it mean, though? Say that again? I mean, it's possible, but what's he talking about losing?
Everything.
Imagine your son has died. Okay, let me rephrase that. Let's say you have one child. That child dies. Are you still a parent? Are you still a father or a mother?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Oh, could I lose all father now? I think, I could be wrong, I think he's saying, it would have been better if you had never been born. Why? Why would I, so you interpret what I said, why would I think that, possibly?
Grieve too much.
Yeah. I've known people who, their first two children were either stillborn or died very soon after birth, like within days. And yet they had more children. Speaking for myself, never would have happened. If we'd had that happen with our first... Why? Who would go through that kind of pain? Think about that for a second. Oh, can I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? What's the state he should envy? Fatherhood? Why will man? Now, is he being gender specific? Well, you mentioned father, that's pretty gender specific. I think he is. So what's the state a man should envy? Becoming a father. I've got multiple degrees. I've done all kinds of things in my life. None of that counts. None of that amounts to a fingernail compared to watching our 4 children being delivered. That's the greatest thing. It's the most mind-blowing thing in the world, right? Is that what he's talking about? Possibly. Oh, could I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? Lament, weep over, mourn over. But then you get the next 2 lines. To have so soon escaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. See, the state man should envy sounds like, within the 2 lines that it is part of, is the state of fatherhood. But I don't think it is. What state is it man now gender neutral, should envy. Close. Really, well, it's necessary before that can happen. Death. Why should we envy death? To escape world's and flesh's rage. Think Hamlet's to be or not to be speech, if you're familiar with it. What's he talk about? He talks about the 1,000 shocks that this flesh is heir to. That's the knocks and bumps, the aches and pains of life. Every one of you has these. I have more, just because I'm older. And if no other misery, yet age. So, the world's rage. Give me an example of the world's rage that makes you want to go, you know, death could be preferable. Politics, man. Turn on the news. Watch it for 5 minutes. My wife and I, our family's Eastern Orthodox. Our Easter / Pascha was this past weekend. We were 1 week off from Western Easter. We were driving home Sunday morning, like at 1 o'clock, 12:30. We left early because I wasn't feeling well. And my wife said, you know, how in the world can Ukrainians and Russians celebrate Pascha today when they're sitting there, at least in eastern Ukraine and southwestern Russia on the border of Ukraine, shooting at each other, killing each other, and they're all Orthodox. They're celebrating Pascha the exact same time. That's part of the world's rage. 3 weeks ago, yesterday, in Nashville, the world's rage. And fleshes. So leave the world, just the passions, anger, love, because both of those can become a rage. I mean, why did John Hinckley attempt to kill President Reagan? Anybody know? Thank you for giving her name. Because he had a crush on Jodie Foster. He wanted to impress her. And she's like, dude. She wasn't out then, but I'm lesbian, you know. Go away. And no, that's not the way you impress a girl. Weird. I don't know. Maybe there are some that are impressed by that. Well, take that back. There definitely are. They're called Charles Manson followers. The Tate murders. And if no other misery, so leave the world alone. Leave the passions alone. Age. The wearing down of the body. Rest in soft peace. And ask, if someone says, who or what are you? Say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. What does he mean? Here lies Ben Jonson's best piece of poetry. It immortalizes his son. I don't know. Maybe this is an epitaph on his son's tombstone. Okay? John Donne wrote an epitaph, and one of the guys who is one of the senior editors on the Variorum edition of the poetry of John Donne went and tracked down a tombstone that actually has the epitaph on it. We didn't think it was. Nobody thought it was until then. In fact, I think it's Donne's wife. Here, Anne Moore Dunn Undone. There's a pun going on. Okay? Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. What's a poem? What's poetry? Lily's like, trick question.
The writer could technically classify that as like their baby, so he could be saying that his son is his best work.
You're exactly right. Why? The Greek word poiesis simply means to make. It's the word from which we get poetry and poem. Poetry is something you make with words. A poem is something made with words. We attribute, we attach from that meaning or onto that meaning all kinds of conventions. For example, does a poem have to rhyme? No, it doesn't. Look at E. E. Cummings. Does it have to have punctuation? E. E. Cummings. Capitalization? E. E. No, it doesn't. Does it have to have meter? Not necessarily. Okay? Some, I would be more of this school, yes, it should have meter, it should have a rhyme scheme, it should have a structure, it should have, and there are quote unquote rules. If one of you for your project said, Dr. Sherman, I'm going to write, I don't know, 4 or 5 villanelles, a very specific structure of poetry, yeah, I'd go, are you sure about that? Because that is one of the most difficult forms to follow. Sonnet, okay, have at it. What kind of sonnet? Italian, Shakespeare, etc. So, what we think of as a poem in terms of its essence, the substance is the meaning. The accidents is its form. He's saying what? Rest in soft peace and say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. As you said, here's the best thing I ever made. And the nice thing about that is it could refer to the physical child, or like Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, it could refer to the poem. That is also celebrating the child, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such. Who's the his? As what he loves may never like too much. For whose sake? Ben Jonson's or his son's? All his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. How can you love something but not like it too much? Don't we invert that today? Don't we, on the spectrum of total indifference to wild, passionately in love, whether you're talking friendship, romantic, etc., filial, familial, etc. Where is a like on that today? It's like, here. I think I like you, etc. And that becomes love. Jonson is kind of inverting that. I'm going to love you, but I'm not going to like you too much. What? So what's his point? Why not like too much?
Easier to accept loss.
That's it. That's entirely it. Because what happens when you love something so much that you do what? Go back to the second line. Put all my hope in you. And then you go and die. The person is destroyed. C.S. Lewis wrote a book when his wife died called The Grief Observed. He published it under the name N.W. Clerk. Why? Because by that time, C.S. Lewis was known the world over, at least in Western culture, as this great apologist for Christianity. He delivered these talks on the BBC during World War II that later get published as Mere Christianity. He wrote a little book supposedly solving the problem of pain, etc. He's a confirmed old bachelor, literally old, living in his house, etc. And this woman from the United States, a divorcee, wants to meet him because she liked his books. And he pushes her off for a while, corresponds. They meet at a hotel, lunch. And he falls wildly, madly in love with her. He marries her when the British government is going to deport her because she doesn't have a visa. He marries her in a civil ceremony just so that she can say, I'm the husband of a wife of a national. The marriage isn't made for any kind of emotional reason. But then, from being around, they're not living together at this point. She's in London, he's in Oxford. They're married. But it's merely a secular marriage of convenience, so she's not deported. But they meet regularly, and he falls wildly in love with her. A confirmed old bachelor. And within a year, they have another wedding, this one a religious wedding, but she's on what they think is her deathbed because she's diagnosed with terminal cancer. 3 years later, she dies. And Lewis is like, what the hell? How dare you? In A Grief Observed, he describes God as the great vivisector. Anybody know what vivisecting is? Or vivisection? Dissecting. God, you cut me open alive. You dirty, rotten son of a... And he just... It's very raw. So if you lost someone, don't read it. You got to wait till you kind of... But it is a grief observed. It's Lewis, the great apologist of Christianity, observing his own grief like from outside the body. And it's very raw and very open, and it traces the progress. And he goes from, how dare you, you effing, to, now I get it. Now I understand. In other words, now I really understand pain. Why? Because when he wrote the book Problem of Pain, it was all theory. I mean, he'd experienced pain, yes. He fought in World War I. He had a lot of friends die. He took care of the mother of one of his friends until she died. Literally, she moved into his home and he cared for her for like 20 years. Some people say there's a romantic involvement. There's no real basis for that, or evidence for that, okay? So, like too much, you can love, but gotta keep some distance. John Donne, a poet we're gonna read next, after Jonson, wrote 3 sonnets after the death of his wife, and all 3, to some extent, talk about the death of his wife. And it's pretty much the same kind of thing. And he comes to the conclusion, she was sent, essentially, to draw him to God. In other words, she's kind of a guide. And when her guiding was ended, she's like, just follow the path now. You can't go wrong, just keep going. Okay? Turn to the memory of my beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, and what he hath left us. And that's what pretty much all of this is going to be about, except for nope. I need those last 2 words. Substance and accidents. That's why I had them up here. It's partially because of what Jonson says in here, that some people don't think William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon was the person who wrote the plays attributed to William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon. Okay? And it's particularly because of what Jonson says about Shakespeare having small Latin and less Greek. There are a couple other things that I'll talk about too. So, at one point I'm going to stop, and we might get stopped and not finish this today, to talk about briefly this issue. Okay? The first 16 lines are kind of like a preface or prologue. And he starts to write, to draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name, am I thus ample to thy book and fame, ample full of. In other words, I don't need to imagine, and I'm not showing envy. Why? Because your book and your fame, that's all that's needed. while I confess thy writings to be such as neither man nor muse can praise too much, there's not a person living who can't overpraise you, he's saying, nor is there a muse. You know, in the Greek ideology, ancient Greece, there were 9 muses of writing. Epic poetry, lyric poetry, pastoral poetry, tragic drama, comedic drama, there's another kind that I'm forgetting, historical writing, etc. 9 different kinds. By the way, an American poet was named the 10th Muse, Anne Bradstreet. First American poet, by the way. Her brother-in-law stole her manuscript book of poems, took them to the United Kingdom, Britain, published them, entitled them the 10th Muse, elevating her to one of the gods of poetry, essentially. So he says, not even the muses can overpraise your poems or your writings. 'Tis true in all men's suffrage. That is, this is an inalienable fact, and everyone agrees with me. But cross that out. That's not how I meant to begin. But he goes on without crossing it out, interestingly. These ways were not the paths I meant unto thy praise. For silliest ignorance on these may write. On these what? He hasn't given any specifics, has he? He hasn't talked about phrases, turns of speech, imagery, which when it sounds at best, but echoes right. And I think he's kind of alluding there to the people who go, you're at a party or something and you say, I just saw so-and-so's, whatever, Hamlet. Oh, I love Shakespeare. And then you start asking questions and you realize this person doesn't know anything but the name, Shakespeare. They've not read, they've not seen, okay? Or blind affection, which doth near advance the truth, but gropes and earthers all by chance. Or crafty malice, that is, some people might praise you, but be intending to kind of like, damn with faint praise, not give the praise your due, and think to ruin where it seemed to raise. These kind of people are as some infamous bawd or whore should praise a matron. What could hurt her more? Now, I don't know if Jonson has in mind some infamous bawd or whore from their day. Probably there were some. But, would you really want some well-named internet whore or something like that praising your mother? Well, she's just like me. No, she's not. That's kind of the thing he's getting at. But thou, who's the thou? Shakespeare. And it could also be Shakespeare's book, his writings. Thou art proof against them, and indeed above the ill fortune of them or the need. In other words, they're so little and small and insignificant. No matter what they say, Shakespeare, they can't touch you. I therefore will begin. In other words, scratch all that. Here comes the beginning of the real epitaph. Soul of the age. Now, later, he's going to say he was not for an age, but for all time. But just soul of the age. Ancient Greek conception of the universe comes from a guy named Ptolemy in 150 BC, a Greek mathematician, and the conception of the universe is called the Ptolemaic conception. It's geocentric. Earth is at the center, and Earth is surrounded by 9 concentric spheres, right? Outside that 9th sphere is empty space. It's just called the Empyrean. That's where God dwells. God is, according to Aristotle, the primum mobile, the first mover. God, however, in and of himself is unmoving. He's totally stationary. But God makes everything else move. He makes this 9th sphere move, so it starts moving, And when it starts moving, it makes the next sphere move. And the combination of those two make the next sphere move, so that by the time we get to Earth, all these spheres are moving around us, and they influence and affect us. What's that called? Astrology. Read your horoscope. Depends on what time of the year you're born under, what stars ascending, descending, what planet, etc. Okay? What does that have to do with soul of the age? This idea gets Christianized in the Middle Ages. The whole movement of the spheres, the whole sphere conception of the universe. In each sphere, so think of this as a sphere, okay? Let's say this is Earth. Leave this alone for a second. Say this is Earth. We are in a sphere. That is, Earth has a controlling power. Each sphere has a controlling power or intelligence. Let's say this is the air around the Earth. What is the controlling power or intelligence of the Earth? Think, if you're familiar, St. Paul, the prince of the power of the air. That refers to, anybody? The devil, Satan. Satan's in control. You can go back to Daniel and you can read about Daniel has this vision and he sees the archangel Michael. And Michael is getting ready to do battle with another angel. Not a good one, a fallen one. And they are angelic intelligences, let's say, over nations. So the Old Testament portrays each country or each nation has an intelligence, a guard, a protector. Take this down to the micro level, and what does that refer to? Each person in that system has a guardian angel. Okay? The flip side of that, in the Warner Brothers theological vision, is what? So you have your guardian angel here, always on the right side, and you have your diabolical demon on the left side. And they're doing what? They're warring over you. And which one controls you determines your actions. Okay? So, here's the sphere. Think of this not as Earth and the air. Think of this instead of as, let's say, England. And this is the age. The ruling intelligence, the soul, is Shakespeare, Jonson is saying. Notice, not Elizabeth, not James. Jonson is kind of suggesting it's not the Elizabethan period. It's not the Renaissance. It's what? It's the Shakespearean period. Okay? Soul of the age. Informing intelligence of the age. The spirit dominating, the animating power of the age. The applause, delight, the wonder of our stage. What's he said so far? What kind of praise is this? The highest you can get. Nobody said that about Ben Jonson, by the way. Never. My Shakespeare, rise. This is like, Lazarus, come forth. There's a reason why he can say Shakespeare, rise. It's in the last part of the poem that we're probably not going to get to. I will not bid thee, I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spenser or Beaumont lie a little further to make thee, bid Beaumont lie a little further to make thee a room. He's talking about Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So a lot of people think Poets' Corner is something relatively recent, like in the last couple of years, couple hundred years. No. When Jonson's writing this, okay, that section of Westminster Abbey is already dedicated to famous writers of the English language. If I remember correctly, Christopher Marlowe has a monument in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Christopher Marlowe was an avowed atheist. He would probably go, what the hell? I don't belong in an abbey. Put me in a bar somewhere, you know. He died in a bar, supposedly in a bar fight. So he says, I'm not going to ask Chaucer or Edmund Spenser or Francis Beaumont to budge over, make some room for Shakespeare. No, why not? Thou art a monument without a room. You don't even actually need a monument. And yet, go to Westminster Abbey and there is a monument, there is a horrible sculpture of Shakespeare in the Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. And art alive still while thy book doth live. Might Jonson be alluding to something there? Something we've read? Sonnet 18. Those last two lines of Sonnet 18. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. As long as Shakespeare's book still doth live, and we have wits to read and praise to give, what? Shakespeare is alive. That I not mix thee so, my brain excuses. Mix thee how? Mix him with Chaucer, Spenser, Beaumont, Fletcher? He says, no. I mean with great, but disproportioned muses. Muses is capitalized. So who are the muses he's talking about? He's not talking about the 9. I don't think he's necessarily talking about the 9. He's going to elevate English authors. For if I thought my judgment were of years, that is, my judgment of your abilities, of your skill, if I thought, Shakespeare's the greatest writer of the last 100 years. People will talk about novelists today. So-and-so, the greatest playwright of the 20th century, the greatest author of the 20th century, the greatest author of the 19th century, etc. No. If I thought my judgment were of years, I should commit thee surely with thy peers. If I were going to do this, then I'd put you somewhere with others who lived and wrote while you did. And he starts naming them. And tell how far thou didst our Lily outshine. John Lilly, who wrote a book called Euphues, or The Golden Legacy. God-awful, boring thing I read, because Renaissance was my area, one of my areas. Okay? Thomas Kidd, Spanish tragedy, good revenge tragedy. A lot of dead bodies at the end. Christopher Marlowe, Marlowe's Mighty Line. Dr. Faustus, Tamerlane, Hero and Leander, etc. So I'd compare you with those guys. And though thou had small Latin and less Greek, from thence, that is, from Latin and Greek, to honor thee I would not seek for names, but call forth. And he named some names. So why does he say he wouldn't seek for names? What do you use Google search for? If you use Google search, I don't. You search for something, right? Famous Greek and Latin authors. He goes, I wouldn't need to do that. Why? He knows exactly who he would compare Shakespeare to. But call forth, thundering, Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. Who are Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles? And then he mentions three others. Well, the first three, they're the trinity of Greek tragic writers, Greek tragedians. Aeschylus wrote the Oresteia, the plays about Agamemnon and his children, Agamemnon's death, etc. Euripides wrote about Medea, for example, and Jason and a bunch of other figures of myth. Sophocles, the Oedipus cycle. And Aristotle focuses on Sophocles because he says, this is it. This is the pinnacle of drama. Nobody gets better than Sophocles. What has Jonson just done? I bring these three. And he mentions a few others. I would call them to life again. To hear thy buskin tread and shake a stage. Thy buskin, you got a footnote down at the bottom. The boot worn by actors in Greek tragedies is so a metonym for tragic drama. Okay? The sock, shoes worn by actors in Greek and Roman comedies. Different kind. Okay? So he says, shake a stage, or when thy socks were on, leave thee alone for thy comparison. To hear thy buskin, the kind of boot worn, socks, the kind of shoes worn. Shakespeare's day, when a tragedy was going on, was being performed, the flag, the pennant that flew from the globe, had a mask. The mask was kind of a frown. If it was a tragedy. If it was a comedy, it had kind of a smiley face. Okay? So he says, I would leave thee alone for the comparison of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome sent forth, or since did from their ashes come. That is, or the stuff that has been produced after Greece and Rome died from the ashes of Greece and Rome. That is, the rejuvenated writings of plays based upon Greek and Roman sources. The Renaissance. No. Triumph my Britain. That is, Britain is triumphant over Greece and Rome. Thou hast one to show to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. Shakespeare, in his writings, Jonson is saying, all other European writers have got to go, hail Shakespeare, hail Shakespeare. All other scenes of Europe, that is, natural portrayals, battlefields, courts, countrysides, they owe homage to Shakespeare. He was not of an age but for all time. And by saying that, he's essentially saying Shakespeare, because he does revive some of ancient Greece and Rome, he includes elements of Greek and Roman tragedies and comedies in his plays. He has some of those writers as source material. He does what? He looks back all the way to the beginning of drama, but also he was not of an age but for all time. He looks forward. Harold Bloom, famous American literary critic, wrote a book on Shakespeare, and for the life of me, I can't remember the title. And he talks about Shakespeare kind of being the focal point of all Western civilization. That is, everything before points to Shakespeare. Everything after points back to Shakespeare. Everybody, every writer after. Bloom argues. A lot of critics don't believe this, don't accept his argument. I'm neither here nor there on it. A lot of critics say everybody after Shakespeare, in one sense or another, builds upon Shakespeare or stands on Shakespeare's shoulders. And everybody else points to him. So, all the muses still were in their prime when, like Apollo, he came forth to warm our ears, or like a Mercury to charm. All the muses were still in their prime. What does that mean? It does mean the ancient muses, the ancient Greek muses. They were in their prime. They were fully alive. They were virile. They were full of their, I have to create a word, inspiratorial powers. Their ability to inspire, or their ability to use The word that we use a lot today, but we don't really know what it really means. To enthuse people. Like the word enthusiasm. What does it mean to be enthusiastic? Or to have enthusiasm? Or to be enthused? Let's go, hell yeah, let's take that hill. What does it literally mean? In or inside God. It means to be in-Godded, to have God breathe into you. Just unpack that for a little bit and let it sit there. It means to be filled with this divine power and spark. All right? Lost my place. And all the muses still were in their prime. What do the muses do? They're the ones who inspire the various people who write different kinds of stuff. So they were in their prime, in their youth. Because what happens when you lose your prime? You can't reproduce. Men can. Many women would say unfair. Women can't after menopause. He's saying, when Shakespeare was alive, all those muses were like 20-year-olds. Let's go out and... With what? With Shakespeare's mind. They were just filling Shakespeare with ideas. Nature herself was proud of his designs. Nature. Look at this walnut tree out here. He's saying nature was like, oh, I want Shakespeare to describe this tree, to describe this flower, to describe these people, to describe human nature, human conversation. Why? Nature herself was proud of his designs and enjoyed to wear the dressing of his lines. In other words, nature is the substance, the essence of what Shakespeare is writing about. And the accidents, the appearance, is Shakespeare's lines about it. What does every writer write about? It's peculiar and particular to each writer. What is it he or she writes about? What he or she knows. What's the hardest thing to write? Something you don't know anything about. Why? Because you'll have no words. If you know a whole lot about something, it bubbles out. Jonson's saying Shakespeare had a direct connection to nature. Not nature in the romantic, not sex, but Wordsworthian, Coleridgean, go out and enjoy trees and experience God, and that kind of nature. Which were so richly spun, his lines, which were so richly spun and woven so fit, as since she will vouchsafe no other wit. What does the as since mean? What does nature no longer do? Shoot.
I was going to say, you want somebody to write about it?
Close. She no longer looks for anybody else to write about nature. She'll no longer vouchsafe another wit. Why? Shakespeare's dead. Nobody else is close. What does Jonson just kind of introduce to the poem? That is alluded to in the first line. Envy. Damn it, Bill. How come you were able to do this to this degree and I can't? And Jonson is not known for his portrayal of human characters and human relationships. My reading of Shakespeare, right, when I teach the intro to Shakespeare course, one of the things I always say is, I think Shakespeare, of all writers of English, he's kind of like what's described in Hamlet, the observed of all observers. In other words, Shakespeare is not the one watched. He's the one doing the observing. I just heard something the other day. It's an interview with a writer, a journalist. And the journalist was talking about what she likes to do. She doesn't fly around from place to place. She drives around. She drives on back roads. She never takes highways, turnpikes, only goes on back roads, only visits local diners, local gas stations, never goes to a chain, restaurant or gas station. She gets her information by talking to people on the ground in their communities. And she goes, you know what, I'll go in a diner and I'll just go and I'll sit in a back corner and I just watch people. And I think that's exactly what Shakespeare did. And that's why you get the full panoply of human experience and expression. Love, anger, hatred, joy, sorrow, everything. And since she will vouchsafe no other wit. I think Jonson's a little jealous of that. The merry Greek, tart Aristophanes, Terence, witty Plautus, they don't please us now. He's saying, even if someone puts on a play by Aristophanes, like Clouds or Frogs, where he pokes fun at Socrates for having his head in the clouds, they don't please us. Go to London today or in the summer, you won't find many plays by the ancient Greeks performed. You'll find a lot of Shakespeare's, even the quote-unquote bad ones, like Titus Andronicus. Not one of his best things, okay? But antiquated and deserted lie as they were not of nature's family. Why? They're too artificial, is what Jonson is saying. Yet I must not give nature all. Thy art, my gentle Shakespeare, must enjoy a part. What's he mean? I must not give nature all. Thy art, he says, must enjoy a part. What's meant by art? Louder?
His poetry?
Okay, yeah, but how did he get his poetry? How did he make his poetry? That's what Jonson's getting at. Nature is the substance, what he writes about. How does he get to be or not to be? That is the question. Or shall I compare thee to a summer's day? How many of you, the projects you turned in, the papers, the meditations, whatever, you turned in or are going to turn in by 11:59 tonight, how many of those you sat down at the keyboard, done, immediately, first draft? That's what Jonson's saying. Shakespeare wasn't entirely born with this skill. Was Michael Jordan born, I sure hope not for his mother's sake, with a basketball in his hand? No, he wasn't. What did he have to do?
Practice.
He had to practice. Did he have to practice as much as I would have to practice? Hell no. He was born with what? Talent. But every talent has got to be honed, trained, sharpened. That's his point. Shakespeare was born with what? With the natural ability. He had a facility for language. J.R.R. Tolkien was born with an ability to learn languages. He could speak like 14 different languages. He could read, I think it is 21. What? Okay? But had to do something with that. Shakespeare had to do something with that ability. What was it? In that he, for though the poet's matter, substance, nature be, his art doth give the fashion. So what's meant by art? Technique, skill. What does that mean in reference to writing? Louder? Keep going. So you have a brain, right? Everybody has a brain. You have an idea. What do you have to do? You got to get it down here, right? Then what do you have to do? How? Literally, what does that involve? Working on an idea. Editing, revising, crossing out, adding in, removing, etc. You perfect it. That's what he says Shakespeare had to do. And that he who cast to write a living line must sweat, such as thine are, and strike the second heat upon the muse's anvil, turn the same and himself with it, that he thinks to frame. Notice the metaphor Jonson uses. He uses the metaphor of smithying, blacksmithing. Writing is like shaping a piece of steel on an anvil. You don't just shape it. What do? When you pound that piece of steel to make a sword, little pieces come off. Translate that metaphor to writing. Is everything you initially brain dump on a page good? Please tell me no, because I'm going to have a bunch of brain dumps here otherwise. No. What's part of the revising process? Removing stuff. My experience, not yours. The stuff that often needed to be removed was the stuff that I thought was just brilliant. Because that usually meant not brilliant. You're in love with yourself. Take that out, in other words. Okay, Thursday we'll pick up with line 65. All right? If you haven't turned something in by 11:59 tonight, if you need to show me hard copies or something, if you've got, send me something digitally, bring that on Thursday. I'll give it back the following day. Again, I'll put up a quiz tonight. It'll probably be due Thursday over the background in Shakespeare sonnets. Know the sonnet numbers for the ones we've gone through.